We were sitting in the living room, watching the sludgy rain come down as it tried to harden into snow. The seasons were changing, but they were also slow to do so here in Appalachia. The forecast had called for a little heat spell this weekend, if you could call 60 a heat spell, I guess, and Grandpa had somehow convinced me that we needed an early spring camping trip. I had been understandably hesitant. Grandpa's cough had been staying at its normal level and output, and the breathing treatments didn't seem to be helping. They were stopping it from getting any worse, but they really weren't making it any better. Grandpa swore it was just a winter chill, and once it got hot again, he would kick it, but like last year, I wasn't so sure. But I had been interested in some camping, so I'd agreed. Now, the storm had rolled in for the next few days, and it kept us out of the woods and Glimmer in her cave as she prepared to re-winterize her people's home. Glimmer seemed to have taken on a much larger role for her people, and she was working with the Queen directly from what I understood. I was proud of her, but it sometimes took her away for days on end, and I missed her, something fierce. Grandpa was sulking, sitting in his chair and looking away from me with his arms crossed like a pouting child. He had still wanted to go, been adamant that we should go, but I couldn't get him out there and risk him getting pneumonia. I could get him out of the woods, but he might still do his lungs a mischief, and I didn't know how many more trips to the hospital the old guy had in him, ghost attacks aside. We had argued a bit. He had threatened to go by himself, but finally, he had understood where I was coming from and agreed not to go off on his own. That didn't mean he liked it, and he was now grumbling darkly to himself. "Are you still grumbling?" I asked, looking up from my phone. "I was looking forward to this trip too, but the weather isn't exactly amenable to our trip." Grandpa made a dismissive sound. "Peh, I used to camp in all kinds of weather. Rain, snow, sleet, hail." "You sure you were a trucker?" I said. "Sounds like you were a mailman." He laughed, the first genuine laugh I had gotten out of him in a while. "Shoot, I was hunting in weather like this when I saw the Pale Men gathering." I raised an eyebrow. "The Pale Men? Haven't heard of them before." "Well, I tell you what, you make me a cup of that hot honey tea that I like, and I'll tell you all about 'em." I laughed. I would have made him tea anyway, but I went over to the kitchen and got out the lemon tea he liked, added honey and peppermint, and boiled it till it was fragrant enough to make me want a cup too. I brought it to him, and he mmm'd appreciatively as he took a sip, the steam wafting up across his face as he tested the hotness. He must have found it to be a little too warm for more than an experimental sip, because he set it aside and folded his hands in his lap. "This was a little before Easter, probably a week before, and I'd gone to the woods to catch my family something for a meal. I was after pheasant or maybe an early year turkey, but I would have lugged home a deer or boar just the same. Your mother was about 6, your uncle 4, and your mother was finally old enough to help your grandma take care of some house chores and her younger sibling. Your grandma told me to bring home something nice and kissed me on the cheek, and off I headed with some supplies and my rifle. The weather was mild, the last of the snows having dried up weeks ago, and I intended to sleep rough for a couple of nights and then come back with something for a fine Easter dinner. What I got was a sudden spring storm that left me taking shelter under a copse of trees that I'd tied together with twine. The rain was cold, and it was coming down in buckets. It was too wet to even think about a fire. I was forced to use my game bag as improvised cover, and I sat miserable and wet as the rain dripped through my canopy and onto my back. It was dark out, the moon shining down sporadically through the trees, when the clouds parted, and I was just thinking about maybe trying to slog home through the dark when I saw something. Not 20 feet away, springing suddenly to life like a light bulb had been flipped on, a fire came to life, and the sounds of a party met my ears. It was a real swinging party, too. There was music, though I didn't see any instruments, and it seemed to dance around my head like a swarm of fairies. They had a table set up with food and wine. The meats were smoking, fresh from whatever fire they had used to cook them, and they had set out the most fantastic things I had ever seen. Candied chestnuts that were still in the shell, puddings with strawberry fish swimming across them, great piles of chocolate, many kinds I had never even known existed. The table was laid heavy with food and drink, and the revelers were no less unique. They were tall and pale, their clothes looking regal and airy. I was in awe of them, their features sharp as any painting from ages past. They were loud, their laughter echoing through the forest, and they seemed unbothered by the rain. There in the glade, I realized there was no rain, and they were swaying and dancing like drunks as they spoke to each other. Their language was strange, and it had too many syllables for my ears to make sense of, but they understood it well enough. They laughed and sang, taking small bites here and there of the food and drinking deeply from their goblets. They were a merry group indeed, and as I sat in the cold and watched them, I seethed in silent hatred of them. Why should they stand in comfort while I sat in the rain? It was unfair. It was unchristian of them not to invite me out of the rain to their party, and I sat smelling the food and listening to their chatter. I decided finally that I would go see who these people were. I wasn't afraid of them. I wasn't afraid of much in these woods, and I believed I could defend myself if they decided they meant to harm me. I had faced forest creatures before and come out on top, but I was about to learn something new that night. I had taken a single step from my lean-to when I heard something coming up the trail to my left. I got low, sliding soundlessly back into my concealing copse of trees, but the rain would cover any sound I was making. I saw two more of the pale things coming up, carrying a wooden frame between them, and attached to that frame was a person. He was naked from the waist up, his pants wet and clinging to him, and someone had stuffed a rag into his mouth deep enough that I could hear him choking. He was struggling, trying to get away, but they had tied him up pretty well. He could see the gathering of creatures ahead, and they made him struggle all the more. One of the creatures carrying him said something to the others, and they turned and clapped, their applause moving through the silent forest like a condemnation. They stuck the corners of the wooden frame into the ground and held it there as the man struggled and begged them to let him go. He said he wouldn't tell, that he wouldn't say anything, that he hadn't seen anything, and if they just let him go, he'd never come back to these woods or any woods ever again. I didn't recognize him, which I suppose was a blessing. If he had been someone from town and I'd been forced to see his family as they mourned him, it might have been more than I could bear. The creatures gathered around him, poking at him and laughing at him, and when one of them raised his hand for silence, I prepared to make my move. They hadn't seen me. They probably didn't even know I was there. I could throw a shield in front of him. I could shove them all away. I could set them on fire. All my plans leaked out of me when the one with his hands raised began to change. He turned his head, the moon coming out to perfectly frame him in its light, and I saw the sides of his mouth rip open like a snake. Inside were rows and rows of needle-sharp teeth, a triple layer of lightly packed sewing needles that seemed to gleam in the light of the full moon. He turned and looked at the crowd, and I could see his eyes had become cat-like, sideways, slitted. He said something to them, the words changing as they passed through those odd teeth, before turning and biting the man just above the left nipple. The man screamed, of course he did, and the creatures came away with nothing but red covering those teeth. He didn't tear flesh from the man, he just stabbed him with his pointy teeth, ripping into his skin, and then turned to invite the others to do likewise. Suddenly, the glade was full of ripping and tearing, their mouths coming open as their faces tore, and soon they were all gathering around him, biting and gnashing their teeth. The marks were terrible, the flesh red and purple as they sank those teeth into him again and again. He writhed in agony, his eyes roving as he begged them to stop, begged God to help him. And as they kept biting him, the two of us locked eyes. He saw me in my hiding place, and his eyes begged me for help. I wouldn't, though. Couldn't, though. I'm no coward. You know that, but I was afraid. What if my magic did nothing to those creatures? What if they shrugged it off and came for me? What if they sank those teeth into me too, again and again, and didn't stop till I was just half chewed meat? I didn't know what to do. I'd never encountered anything like this, and there were so many of them. My mind raced. I was shaking in my cold little hole as they killed this man. When they finally stepped away from him, it was too late to do much of anything. The man had been bitten so much that his skin looked bruised. They'd bled him like a hog. As he hung there, one of them bit his throat out, and I cringed from the sight as they drank his blood. They lapped at him like dogs, and as they did, I scrunched down in my hiding spot and put my hands over my mouth as I tried not to scream. If they heard me, they would do the same to me. I was scared of never coming back, of just disappearing into the forest. But I was even more afraid that these things would find my family. I hadn't known that they existed till tonight, but suddenly I felt less comfortable than I ever had in the woods. I lay there, moving as little as possible, till the rain finally stopped. I looked up then, slowly rising to my knees, and found that dawn was approaching. I also found that the table and the revelers that had magically appeared had just as magically departed. I got my gun, I got my things, and I got the hell out of there. On the way home, by some turn of luck, I scrambled across a half-decent sized grouse that had gotten its leg broken by a fallen tree limb. I put it out of its misery and popped it into my game bag. I didn't want to think about it too much. Seeing its bleeding wounds where its had once been made me think of the man I had stood by and allowed to die. All in all, it was a good Easter, but I never stayed in the woods during a full moon ever again. I looked at your grandma's book, something I'd brought me a little piece once I found the right passage, and discovered that Grandma had seen them too. She called them pale men, and they only held their feasts on the night of the full moon. They would take travelers and bums from the road and use them for their revels. She, too, was careful never to go into the woods during a full moon. I still think about it sometimes. I think about it, and it fills me with shame. It was the only time I ever stood by and did nothing after I became a man, and I swore that the next time I was privy to such a thing, I would be braver. I was the protector of this area in many ways, and I vowed to never stand by and just watch as someone was hurt ever again. The rain came down as we both sat in silence. My tea had gone cold, as had Gramps'. I shook my head as I blew out a whistle. Jesus, Grandpa, why would you tell me a story like that? He glanced at me, his eyes a little condescending. Why do I tell you anything, kid? So that when I'm dust in the ground, you can know things, know them, and use them to help to help other people. I went to get Grandpa's cup, meaning to warm it up, and that's when I noticed the moon through the clouds as it peeked through the window. It was full, swollen to the rim, and shining wetly upon the hills of Appalachia. Somewhere in those woods, someone could be losing their life tonight, a victim of the pale men and their strange revels. I tried not to shudder as I took his cup to the stove, but Grandpa, as usual, took notice. You're still here. Thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague here. Always a pleasure to see all my new and old viewers coming by for another one of my spooky tales. If you'd like to support the show, you can always take part in one of our channel offers through Fume or Aura, or you can just click on another video when they come up. I'd really appreciate it. For our newer viewers, we also have lots of playlists and other things if you'd like to get caught up. I know some of my series have been going on for quite a while. If you'd like to get my latest book, there's a link down below that'll take you to my Amazon page. Towesey Homestead just came out, so if that's something you'd like to get your hands on, go ahead and have a look down there. If you'd like a signed copy, you can go ahead and email me from my email address on the site, and I'll get with you about shipping information and ship you a signed copy. If you'd like to support the channel in a more monetary fashion, we also have membership through YouTube, and we've got a Patreon that you can get the information for in the description. We have lots of tiers and everything to suit your needs. Patrons that support on the $10 tier, that's our Ghostly Reader tier, get a book anytime I write one, signed and on their doorstep. As you may have noticed, there's a list of patrons and members on the screen, and I'd like to personally thank every one of them for taking a hand in the future of this channel. Well, that's enough for tonight. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.